The mid-20th century was a period of unbridled technological optimism, where humanity believed that every social and environmental ill could be solved through the application of radical engineering and master planning. In the heart of this era, a visionary scientist named Athelstan Spilhaus proposed a project so audacious that it challenged the very definition of urban living. This was the Minnesota Experimental City, or MXC, a multi-billion-dollar attempt to build a completely autonomous, high-tech metropolis from scratch in the isolated wilderness of Aitkin County. The MXC was not intended to be a mere suburb or a traditional expansion. It was designed as a living laboratory for 250,000 people, a city that would eliminate pollution, traffic, and waste through a revolutionary integrated infrastructure. At its center stood the most iconic and controversial element of the plan, a colossal geodesic dome that would enclose a significant portion of the city, creating a controlled, perpetual springtime environment regardless of the brutal Minnesota winters. The Minnesota Experimental City represented the ultimate peak of utopian planning, a project so advanced that it promised to render all existing cities obsolete. Before we dive into the spectacular collapse of this glass-walled utopia, please take a moment to hit the like button and subscribe to Never Built. We uncover the lost future that the world canceled. We promise you this: stick with us until the final segment, and you will learn the one specific, chilling social experiment planned for the MXC residents that proved the city would have essentially functioned as a high-tech prison from which no one was ever intended to leave. Here is why this ultimate symbol of futuristic living was abandoned. The first, overwhelming obstacle was the atmospheric paradox. While the geodesic dome promised a perfect climate, engineers quickly realized that trapping 250,000 people and their industrial activities under a glass shell would create a lethal buildup of heat and toxins that no existing ventilation system could handle. The second inescapable hurdle was the subterranean logistics nightmare. To keep the surface pristine and car-free, the entire city relied on a massive, multi-level labyrinth of underground tunnels for waste, deliveries, and utilities, a construction project so complex it threatened to bankrupt the state before a single house was built. Finally, the project was fatally wounded by the environmental backlash. The very people who the MXC was designed to protect, the environmentalists and local residents, saw the project not as a green utopia, but as a massive industrial scar on the pristine wilderness, leading to a political war that reached the highest levels of government. The core of the Minnesota Experimental City concept was the total elimination of the urban mess that plagued existing American cities like Chicago or New York. Spilhaus argued that cities were dying because they were being retrofitted with new technology rather than being designed for it. His solution was a plug-and-play urban grid where everything from housing modules to transit pods was standardized and replaceable. The city was designed with no private automobiles on the surface. Instead, residents would use an automated guideway transit system, a precursor to modern personal rapid transit, which would whisk them from their homes to the central business district in minutes. This entire transport network was intended to run on a massive concrete deck with all dirty functions like trash collection, power generation, and heavy freight moving through the basement of the city. This radical separation of human life from industrial function required an initial capital investment that was unprecedented in the history of North American urban development, creating a financial barrier that many critics argued was insurmountable from day one. The geodesic dome was the crowning achievement and the ultimate technical failure of the MXC design. Inspired by the work of Buckminster Fuller, the dome was intended to solve the problem of the harsh northern climate, allowing for a city where people could walk to work in short sleeves even during a blizzard. However, the thermodynamics of such a structure were a nightmare. A dome covering several square miles would act as a massive greenhouse, trapping solar radiation and the waste heat from the city's own electronics and machinery. Without a cooling system of planetary proportions, the temperature inside the dome would have reached lethal levels within hours of sunrise. Furthermore, the issue of air quality was unsolvable with 1960s technology. The internal atmosphere would have become saturated with CO2 and urban pollutants, requiring a constant, massive exchange of air with the outside environment that would have nullified the dome's insulation benefits. The dream of the domed city was a victim of the very physics it sought to control, proving that nature cannot be simply walled out without catastrophic consequences. The subterranean infrastructure required to support the MXC's pristine surface was a project of such scale that it rivaled the construction of the interstate highway system. Every building in the city was to be connected to a centralized vacuum waste system, which would suck trash through pipes to a remote processing plant where it would be recycled or incinerated for power. All water, electricity, and data lines were to be housed in accessible utilidors, allowing for maintenance without ever digging up a street. While this sounds like a modern smart city, the cost of excavating and lining thousands of miles of high-capacity tunnels in the swampy, unstable soil of northern Minnesota was a logistical impossibility. The engineering team estimated that the subterranean portion of the city would consume over 60% of the total $10 billion budget, leaving little for the actual living spaces. The complexity of managing these interconnected systems was also a massive risk. A single major failure in the central waste or power hub could potentially paralyze the entire city, creating a single point of failure that no traditional city possesses. The political collapse of the MXC was as dramatic as its architectural vision. Despite having the support of major corporations like Boeing and Honeywell, as well as the Federal Department of Housing and Urban Development, the project failed to win over the people of Aitkin County. Local residents viewed the experimental city as a patronizing intrusion by urban elites who wanted to use their land as a laboratory. They were joined by a new generation of environmentalists who argued that building a city for 250,000 people in the middle of a forest was the opposite of ecological planning, regardless of how many domes or recycling systems were used. The legal battles over land use and environmental impact statements dragged on for years, draining the project's momentum and its funding. By 1973, the Minnesota State Legislature, facing a massive budget deficit and intense public pressure, officially pulled the plug on the MXC, leaving behind only a collection of dusty blueprints and a profound lesson in the limits of technocratic utopianism. The city that was designed to be the future was defeated by a combination of unyielding physics and the very democratic friction it tried to engineer away. The second phase of the Minnesota experimental city's descent into obscurity was defined by the technological overreach of its internal mechanics and the realization that the cost of maintaining a synthetic environment was exponentially higher than the value it produced. While the public was captivated by the image of the massive geodesic dome, the internal systems required to make that dome habitable were bordering on the impossible. Engineers at the University of Minnesota and their corporate partners spent years attempting to solve the problem of atmospheric stagnation. In a traditional city, wind and thermal convection naturally disperse the pollutants from heating, industrial processes, and human respiration. Under the MXC dome, the air would have become a toxic soup within days without a mechanical ventilation system of unprecedented scale. The proposed solution involved a series of massive air-scrubbing towers that would draw the internal atmosphere through high-capacity filters and heat exchangers, essentially trying to air-condition a small mountain range. The energy required to run these fans and filters would have consumed the output of multiple dedicated nuclear power plants, creating a carbon footprint that directly contradicted the city's green mission. The automated transit paradox also became a primary source of systemic instability. Spilhaus and his team were adamant that the private car was the greatest enemy of the modern city, occupying valuable space and poisoning the air. Their replacement was an intricate network of computer-controlled personal rapid transit (PRT) pods. These small electric vehicles were designed to run on a dedicated elevated guideway system, connecting every home directly to the commercial and industrial hubs. However, the software and hardware requirements for managing 50,000 autonomous pods in real time, ensuring they could merge, stop, and reroute without collision, were decades ahead of the computing power available in the late 1960s. The project required a centralized mainframe of such complexity that a single software glitch or power surge could result in a citywide gridlock, leaving thousands of residents trapped in plastic pods suspended 30 feet above the ground. The maintenance costs for the thousands of miles of electrified track and the fleet of sophisticated pods were projected to be higher than the entire budget of a traditional public works department, making the MXC an elite enclave that only the wealthiest could afford to inhabit. Beyond the transport and air issues, the social engineering of waste introduced a level of surveillance and control that began to alarm civil liberties advocates. To achieve the pollution-free goal, every resident of the MXC would have been required to participate in a radical recycling program. The vacuum waste system connected to every home was designed to analyze the chemical composition of the refuse it collected. If a resident disposed of prohibited materials or failed to sort their waste correctly, the system would immediately identify the source. This led to the concept of the regulatory city, where every action, from the amount of water used to the type of food consumed, was monitored by a centralized computer to ensure the city's delicate ecological balance was maintained. The designers viewed this as a necessary trade-off for a clean environment, but critics argued that the MXC was transitioning from a utopian experiment into a technocratic panopticon, where the individual was subservient to the efficiency of the machine. The modular housing failure further eroded the economic viability of the city. The plan called for residents to live in prefabricated modular units that could be plugged into the city's utility grid and moved as the family's needs changed. While this promised a flexible and efficient housing market, the reality of building a structure that was both lightweight enough to be moved by crane and strong enough to withstand the thermal stresses inside the dome was a monumental challenge. The cost of manufacturing these specialized modules was significantly higher than traditional on-site construction. Furthermore, the standardized nature of the housing led to concerns about aesthetic sterilization. To maintain the city's efficiency, individual expression in architecture was suppressed, creating a monotonous landscape of plastic and steel that many found dehumanizing. The MXC was becoming a city designed for components, not for human beings, leading to a loss of the very urban soul that Spilhaus sought to save. The financial chasm between the federal grants and the actual cost of construction finally became too wide to ignore. By 1970, the estimated price tag for the first phase of the MXC had risen from $4 billion to over $10 billion. The private corporations that had initially supported the project, such as Honeywell and Control Data Corporation, began to pull back as they realized the project would likely never turn a profit. They saw the MXC as a research and development drain rather than a viable real estate venture. Without a massive and continuous infusion of federal capital, the project was effectively dead. The Nixon administration, facing mounting inflation and the fiscal exhaustion of the Cold War, was increasingly unwilling to fund a fantasy city in the woods of Minnesota. The project was trapped in a cycle of rising costs and diminishing support, proving that even the most brilliant blueprint cannot survive if the economic foundation is built on sand. The third critical phase in the unraveling of the Minnesota experimental city was the strategic and political implosion that occurred when the project's theoretical perfection collided with the messy reality of local democracy and environmental law. By 1971, the MXC was no longer just a collection of architectural sketches. It had become a legislative battleground. The site selection process, which settled on a remote area of Aitkin County, proved to be a catastrophic tactical error. The planners believed that the empty wilderness would provide a blank canvas for their technological masterpiece, but they failed to account for the deep-seated resistance of the local population who viewed the project as an urban invasion. The residents of Aitkin County did not see a green utopia. They saw a massive, artificial glass bubble being dropped onto their ancestral hunting grounds and farmlands by a group of university elites and corporate executives from the Twin Cities. This grassroots opposition formed the backbone of a movement that would eventually dismantle the project's political legitimacy. The environmental paradox of the MXC became its most difficult irony to defend. Athelstan Spilhaus had marketed the city as the ultimate solution to pollution, yet the very process of building it required a massive industrial assault on the environment. To construct a city for 250,000 people, including the colossal geodesic dome and the thousands of miles of subterranean tunnels, would require the clear-cutting of thousands of acres of forest and the draining of vital wetlands. The newly formed Minnesota Pollution Control Agency and several nascent environmental groups pointed out that the MXC was essentially destroying nature to save it. They argued that true ecological planning should focus on fixing existing cities rather than building a high-tech escape pod in the middle of a pristine ecosystem. This internal conflict within the environmental movement stripped the MXC of its progressive status, turning it into a symbol of technocratic arrogance that disregarded the intrinsic value of the natural landscape. The internal structural failure of the dome concept also reached a technical breaking point during this phase. As climatologists and structural engineers conducted more advanced simulations, they realized that the perpetual spring promised by the dome was a physical impossibility. The issue of snow loading and ice accumulation in a Minnesota winter presented a terrifying risk. A single major blizzard could deposit thousands of tons of snow onto the surface of the glass and steel lattice. If the heat from the city inside melted the bottom layer of that snow, it would create a massive ice sheet that could slide off the dome with the force of an avalanche, crushing any structures or transit lines at the perimeter. Furthermore, the cost of the specialized high-strength transparent materials required to cover several square miles was astronomical. No manufacturer in the world could produce the amount of high-performance glass or polymer needed, and the maintenance required to keep the dome clean from dust, bird droppings, and industrial film would have required a permanent army of specialized robots, adding yet another unbudgeted layer of extreme operational expense. The subterranean logistics collapse was the final blow to the project's engineering credibility. The plan to move all unpleasant city functions underground was discovered to be a recipe for a geological disaster. The water table in Aitkin County was significantly higher than the planners had initially estimated. Building a multi-level labyrinth of tunnels and utilidors in such soil would require a continuous, massive pumping operation to prevent the basement of the city from flooding. The energy required just to keep the city dry would have been staggering. Additionally, the heat generated by the underground power plants and waste processing facilities trapped beneath the city's concrete deck and the glass dome above would have created a subterranean heat island effect. This heat would have eventually destabilized the very soil the city was built upon, leading to structural settling and the potential collapse of the elevated transit guideways. The engineers were essentially fighting a war against the Minnesota geography that they could not win. The social engineering backlash also intensified as the details of the city's experimental nature became public. The MXC was not just a city, it was a data mining operation. Every aspect of the city's function was to be monitored by a central computer system to optimize human behavior. Planners discussed using the city to test new forms of social organization, including radical ideas about communal living and the total elimination of currency in favor of a social credit system based on resource consumption. When these plans leaked to the press, the MXC was quickly branded as a communist dystopia or a socialist bubble. The idea that the government and corporations would monitor a citizen's every move, from their trash output to their travel patterns, was anathema to the American ideal of rugged individualism. The experimental part of the Minnesota experimental city became its most terrifying feature, alienating the very middle-class families the project needed to attract to be viable. Finally, the legislative coup de grace came in 1973. The Minnesota State Legislature, tired of the mounting costs and the endless protests from Aitkin County, passed a bill that effectively stripped the MXC authority of its power. The bill required the project to gain the approval of local residents before any construction could begin, an impossible task given the fierce opposition. This legislative maneuver was the death knell for the project. Federal agencies, seeing that the state was no longer fully committed, pulled their remaining grants. The corporate partners, sensing a total loss of investment, officially dissolved their advisory boards. Athelstan Spilhaus, the visionary who had spent a decade dreaming of the Dome City, was left as a man without a country, watching as his blueprint for the future was filed away into the archives of failed utopias. The dream of the MXC died, not because the technology was impossible, but because the human and political cost was too high to pay for a future that looked more like a cage than a home. The fourth and final phase of the Minnesota experimental city's history is the long, silent legacy of its abandonment, a decision that fundamentally redefined the limits of urban planning and shattered the dream of the centralized, climate-controlled utopia. The cancellation of the MXC in 1973 was not just a local policy shift. It was a national epiphany that marked the end of the Great Society era of megaprojects. The project's failure sent a clear message to the world of architecture and science. Technology alone cannot engineer a society, and the environment is not a passive backdrop to be enclosed and manipulated, but a complex, living system that demands respect. The sudden vacuum left by the MXC's collapse forced the American planning community to pivot away from radical, top-down experiments toward the more incremental, community-focused, new urbanism that dominates today. The economic and institutional aftermath of the project's cancellation was a period of painful reflection for the corporate and academic giants involved. Companies like Boeing, Honeywell, and General Electric, which had invested millions in research and development for the MXC's subsystems, were forced to write off their investments as a total loss. The University of Minnesota's planning department, once the epicenter of futuristic urban thought, faced a crisis of credibility as the science of cities was mocked by the public as expensive science fiction. This failure chilled the relationship between the private sector and government-funded urban experiments for decades. The financial disaster of the MXC proved that without a clear, market-driven path to profitability, even the most technologically advanced city is a fiscal impossibility. It established a precedent that has effectively blocked any serious attempt to build a new American city from scratch ever since, reinforcing the dominance of the existing, messy, and organic urban centers. The technological DNA of the Minnesota experimental city, however, did not completely disappear. While the city itself was never built, the research conducted on its modular components and automated systems survived in fragmented forms. The work on computer-controlled personal rapid transit, PRT, although a failure in the 1960s context, laid the theoretical groundwork for modern autonomous vehicle algorithms and ride-sharing logistics. The research into vacuum waste systems and centralized utilidors influenced the design of modern high-density districts and specialized facilities like hospitals and airports. Even the dream of the geodesic dome found a small, practical afterlife in the design of large-scale sports arenas and botanical conservatories, though never again on the scale of a full city. The MXC was a failure of synthesis, but its individual parts provided a library of innovation that would eventually be integrated into the smart cities of the 21st century. The social and civil liberties legacy of the project remains its most haunting aspect. The debate over the MXC's proposed surveillance and behavioral monitoring systems became a foundational case study for the burgeoning field of digital ethics. The project's collapse was a victory for the ideal of the open city, a place of unpredictable human interaction and individual freedom, as opposed to the closed system of the technocratic dome. The fear of the technological panopticon that the MXC represented helped shape early privacy laws and public skepticism towards centralized urban management. It taught a generation of planners that a city is not a machine to be optimized, but a human ecosystem where the right to be inefficient and unmonitored is essential to the quality of life. The MXC serves as a permanent warning that a utopia designed by computers often looks like a prison to the people who have to live in it. The environmental lesson of the MXC's failure was perhaps its most positive contribution. The battle over Aitkin County was one of the first times a major technological project was defeated by a combination of local resistance and ecological scrutiny. This defeat solidified the power of the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, and the necessity of environmental impact statements for all future infrastructure. The realization that green technology can still be environmentally destructive if it ignores the local ecosystem became a core principle of sustainable design. The MXC taught the world that we cannot save nature by paving over it and putting it under glass. True sustainability requires working within the existing natural framework rather than trying to replace it with a synthetic substitute. The Minnesota Experimental City remains a magnificent, ghostly monument to a future that never arrived. It was a project defeated by the very things it tried to eliminate: friction, weather, politics, and the unpredictable nature of human freedom. The decision to abandon the MXC was the definitive moment when we realized that the city of tomorrow cannot be bought for $10 billion or built in a vacuum. The dream of the domed utopia was brought down by the weight of its own glass and the complexity of its own soul. The MXC was not a technical failure. It was a profound misunderstanding of what it means to live in a community. The final question remains: the MXC failed because it tried to control the environment and the people too tightly. Today, we are seeing the rise of smart cities controlled by AI and massive data networks. Do you believe that modern technology can finally succeed where the MXC failed, or is the dream of a perfectly managed domed utopia still a fundamental threat to human liberty? Join the discussion below and tell us. Would you be willing to live in a city with no cars and perfect weather if it meant the government monitored every piece of trash you threw away? If you enjoyed this professional deep dive into the abandoned engineering of the Minnesota Experimental City, like this video and subscribe to the channel for more stories about the incredible projects that were never built.